They say revenge is a dish best served cold. I say it's best served with a side of public humiliation and a garnish of legal consequences. My name is William Thornberry, I'm 73 years old, and this is the story of how my own grandson tried to rob me blind, and how I made absolutely certain he regretted every second of it. It started on a Tuesday morning in late September, the kind of crisp autumn day when the maple trees in my yard burned copper and gold against a brilliant blue sky. I was in my study, reviewing some quarterly dividends from my investment portfolio, when I heard the familiar rumble of my grandson Derek's BMW pulling into the driveway. Now let me paint you a picture of Derek. 20 years old, handsome in that generic catalog model way, always dressed in expensive suits that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. He worked, if you could call it that, at some tech startup in the city, doing something with cryptocurrency and blockchain that he could never quite explain in a way that made sense to anyone over 50. "Grandpa!" he called out as he let himself in through the front door. He'd had a key since he was 16, back when he used to visit every weekend, back when I thought he actually enjoyed spending time with his old grandfather. "In the study, Derek," I called back. He appeared in the doorway, flashing that $1,000,000 smile that had always gotten him out of trouble as a child. "How's my favorite grandfather doing?" "I'm your only grandfather," I replied dryly, not looking up from my papers. "Your mother's father passed away before you were born." Right. He walked over to the leather wingback chair across from my desk and sat down, crossing one leg over the other in that casual way that suggested he owned the place. "Listen, Grandpa, I wanted to talk to you about something important." This should have been my first warning sign. Derek never visited without a reason anymore. Gone were the days when he dropped by just to watch a baseball game or help me in the garden. Now every visit came with an agenda. "What is it?" I asked, finally setting down my reading glasses and giving him my full attention. "Well, I've been thinking about your estate planning," he began, and I felt my eyebrows rise involuntarily. "You're not getting any younger, and I know you've worked hard all your life to build up this wealth. I just want to make sure everything is properly organized so that when the time comes, and I hope that's many, many years from now, everything goes smoothly." I leaned back in my chair, studying his face. His expression was earnest, concerned, the picture of a devoted grandson worried about his aging grandfather's affairs. But something felt off. There was a tightness around his eyes, a barely perceptible tension in his jaw. "That's very thoughtful of you, Derek," I said slowly. "But I have an excellent attorney who's handled my estate planning for the past 30 years. Everything is in perfect order." "Oh, I'm sure it is," he said quickly. "It's just that estate law has changed so much in recent years. Tax codes, probate procedures, it's all gotten much more complicated." I actually have a friend, a brilliant estate attorney, who specializes in this sort of thing. I thought maybe you could meet with him, just to get a second opinion, make sure you're taking advantage of all the latest strategies to protect your assets. "Protect my assets from what, exactly?" I asked. He laughed, but it sounded forced. "From excessive taxation, from probate fees, from all the vultures who try to take advantage of estates in transition. You know how it is." I didn't know how it was. I'd built my fortune from nothing, starting as a construction worker and eventually owning one of the most successful commercial real estate development companies in the state. I'd sold the business 15 years ago for a sum that had set me up quite comfortably for retirement. I owned my home outright, a beautiful Victorian mansion on 5 acres of prime land. I had investments, savings, and a portfolio of rental properties. By any measure, I was a wealthy man. And Derek knew exactly how wealthy. "Tell you what," I said, adopting a tone of friendly cooperation. "Why don't you give me your friend's contact information, and I'll think about it." His face lit up. "That's great, Grandpa. Really great. I think you'll be impressed by what he has to say." He pulled out his phone and started typing. "I'm texting you his details right now. His name is Marcus Vance. Maybe you could meet with him sometime next week?" "I'll see what I can do," I said noncommittally. Derek stayed for another 20 minutes, making small talk about nothing in particular, before heading off to what he claimed was an important business meeting. After he left, I sat in my study for a long time, staring at the contact information on my phone. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones, the same way I'd always been able to sense when a business deal was about to go south. Derek's sudden interest in my estate planning, his urgency about meeting with this attorney friend, it all felt calculated, rehearsed. I decided to do a little investigating. First, I called my own attorney, Richard Morrison, who'd been handling my affairs since I sold the company. "Richard, it's William Thornberry. I need to ask you something. Has anyone contacted you recently about my estate? Anyone claiming to be acting on my behalf or on behalf of my family?" There was a pause on the other end. "Actually, William, yes. About a month ago, a young man called asking about your estate documents. He claimed to be your grandson and said he was helping you organize your affairs. I told him I couldn't discuss your private matters without your explicit permission, and he became quite insistent, even a bit aggressive. I had to threaten to report him to the Bar Association before he backed off. My blood ran cold. Did he give you his name?" "He said his name was Derek Thornberry." So Derek had already been making moves without my knowledge. This was more serious than I'd thought. "Richard, I want you to make a note in my file that under no circumstances are you to discuss my affairs with anyone, including family members, without my direct authorization. And if anyone contacts you again, I want to know about it immediately." "Of course, William. Is everything all right?" "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. "But I intend to find out." My next call was to an old friend of mine, Frank Delaney, a retired private investigator who'd helped me out with some corporate espionage issues back in my business days. Frank was in his late 60s now, but he still kept his hand in the game, doing background checks and surveillance work for select clients. "Frank, I need you to look into someone for me. My grandson, Derek Thornberry." "Your Derek?" Frank sounded surprised. "What's going on, Bill?" "I'm not sure yet. But something doesn't smell right. I want to know everything: his financial situation, his business dealings, who he's been meeting with, everything." "You got it. Give me a week." That week felt like the longest of my life. I went about my normal routines, my morning walks, my afternoon reading, my evening chess games online, but my mind was constantly churning, trying to figure out what Derek was planning. He called twice during that week, both times with some pretext for visiting, once to borrow some old family photos, and once to ask my advice about a supposed business opportunity. I put him off both times, claiming I was under the weather. Finally, Frank called me back. "Bill, you'd better sit down for this." I was already sitting, but I gripped the arms of my chair a little tighter. "Tell me. Your grandson is in deep trouble. He's got gambling debts totaling about $300,000 with some very unsavory characters. And that's just what I could verify. The real number might be higher. $300,000. My God! There's more," Frank continued. "That tech startup he works for? It's basically a pyramid scheme disguised as a cryptocurrency investment platform. The SEC is investigating them, and Derek is one of the principals named in the investigation. If they're found guilty, and from what I can tell, they will be, he's looking at serious prison time, not to mention massive civil penalties." I closed my eyes, feeling a mix of disappointment and anger wash over me. "What else?" "He's been meeting regularly with an attorney named Marcus Vance. And here's where it gets really interesting. Vance isn't primarily an estate attorney. He specializes in elder law and estate manipulation. He's been investigated twice by the state bar for allegedly helping clients defraud elderly relatives, though nothing was ever proven. The picture was becoming clearer, and I didn't like what I was seeing. "There's one more thing," Frank said, his voice growing darker. "I managed to get a look at some text messages between Derek and Vance. They're planning something, Bill. Something big. From what I could piece together, they're trying to get you declared mentally incompetent so Derek can take control of your estate through a conservatorship." A conservatorship. Of course. It was the perfect scheme. If Derek could convince a court that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs, he could be appointed as my conservator, giving him complete control over my finances. He could pay off his debts, settle his legal troubles, and leave me with nothing. And I'd never see a penny of my own money again. Frank, I said, my voice steady despite the fury building inside me, I want you to keep digging. I want every detail of their plan. Every meeting, every document, every conversation. Can you do that? Consider it done. Over the next several weeks, I became intimately familiar with every aspect of Derek's scheme. Frank was thorough, perhaps the most thorough he'd ever been in his career. He planted listening devices, hired additional investigators to tail Derek and Vance, and even managed to get access to their email correspondence through means I decided it was better not to know about. The picture that emerged was even more disturbing than I'd imagined. Derek and Marcus Vance had been planning this for at least 6 months, long before Derek's first visit to discuss my estate planning. They'd developed an elaborate strategy to systematically undermine my credibility and create a paper trail that would support a claim of diminished mental capacity. Here's how it was supposed to work. First, Derek would slowly isolate me from my friends and other family members by suggesting to them that I was becoming forgetful, confused, perhaps showing early signs of dementia. He'd already started this process, I learned, dropping hints to my daughter Margaret, his mother, that I'd seemed off during his recent visits. Second, Vance would arrange for me to be evaluated by a carefully selected doctor, one who had a history of providing convenient diagnoses in exchange for generous fees. This doctor would conduct a cursory examination and produce a report declaring me mentally unfit to manage my affairs. Third, Derek would file a petition for conservatorship in probate court, complete with the doctor's report and testimony from himself and his mother about my supposed decline. Given the usual rubber-stamp nature of these proceedings, especially when family members agreed on the need for intervention, he expected little resistance. Fourth, once appointed as conservator, Derek would have essentially unlimited access to my assets. He'd pay off his gambling debts first, about $320,000 by the latest count. Then he'd settle with the SEC investigators by paying the civil penalties they were demanding, probably another $500,000 or more. After that, he'd manage my estate in a way that would slowly drain it into his own pockets through legal fees, management fees, and various other creative accounting methods. By the time I died, and the way they discussed it in their emails, they were clearly hoping that would be sooner rather than later. There would be almost nothing left. Margaret would get a pittance, Derek would be set for life, and I would spend my final years warehoused in some cut-rate nursing facility, completely unaware that my own grandson had robbed me blind. But here's what Derek didn't know. I'd been a master strategist in the business world for 40 years. I'd outmaneuvered corporate raiders, outsmarted competitors, and navigated countless complex negotiations. I didn't build my fortune by being naive or easy to manipulate. And I was about to teach my grandson the most expensive lesson of his life. I started by securing my assets. I met with Richard Morrison and we restructured my estate in ways that would make it virtually impossible for anyone to access my money without my explicit consent. We set up multiple layers of protection, irrevocable trusts, power of attorney restrictions, and various other legal mechanisms that would throw up massive roadblocks to any conservatorship attempt. Next, I documented everything. Every visit from Derek, every phone call, every interaction. I kept detailed notes, recording dates, times, and exact conversations. I also made sure to continue my normal activities in a very public way, establishing a clear record of my mental competence. I increased my participation in my investment club, even giving a well-received presentation on market trends to a group of 30 people. I volunteered at the local library, teaching a class on small business development to aspiring entrepreneurs. I wrote several opinion pieces for the local newspaper on city planning issues. I made sure there was an overwhelming amount of evidence demonstrating that I was sharp, engaged, and fully in command of my faculties. But I didn't stop there. I wanted Derek to believe his plan was working. I wanted him to feel confident, secure, ready to make his move. Because the further he went down this path, the worse it would be for him when everything came crashing down. So I started playing my part. When Derek visited, I'd occasionally pretend to forget small details. Nothing major, just little things that could be dismissed as normal senior moments, but that would feed his narrative. I'd asked him the same question twice in one conversation. I'd briefly struggled to remember the name of an old business associate. I'd seemed confused about what day of the week it was. Derek ate it up. I could see the gleam in his eyes every time I had one of these lapses. After each visit, he'd call his mother, and Frank's wiretap would pick up his excited reports about how Grandpa is really starting to slip. Meanwhile, I had Frank maintain continuous surveillance on both Derek and Vance. I learned that Derek was now up to $380,000 in gambling debts, and that his creditors were getting increasingly aggressive. One of them had threatened to break his legs if he didn't pay up within 60 days. I also discovered that the SEC investigation into his company was moving forward rapidly, and that criminal charges were likely to be filed within the next 3 months. Derek was desperate, cornered, and that made him dangerous, but also careless. The breakthrough came in early November. Frank managed to obtain a copy of the actual petition for conservatorship that Vance had prepared. It was a masterpiece of legal fiction, painting me as a doddering old fool who couldn't remember his own address, who made wild accusations about people stealing from him, who was at risk of being exploited by unscrupulous individuals. The irony was almost too perfect. The petition included the report from the corrupt doctor, Dr. Reginald Hayworth, who I learned had lost his medical license in 2 other states for similar conduct. The report described me as suffering from moderate to severe cognitive decline consistent with Alzheimer's disease or related dementia, based on an examination that had never actually taken place. There were also sworn affidavits from Derek and Margaret, describing my supposed deterioration and expressing their loving concern for my well-being. Reading Margaret's affidavit was particularly painful. My daughter, deceived by her own son, genuinely believing I was losing my mind. But the most damning piece of evidence was a series of emails between Derek and Vance discussing exactly how they'd spend my money. They'd already divided it up in their minds. So much for Derek's debts, so much for the SEC settlement, so much for Vance's fees, and the rest to be managed by Derek through various shell companies and offshore accounts. In one particularly chilling email, Vance had written, "Don't worry about the old man finding out. By the time the conservatorship is approved, he'll be so heavily medicated he won't know what day it is. And if he does figure it out, who's going to believe him? He's legally incompetent." Derek's response: "Perfect. Let's move forward. I need this done by Thanksgiving at the latest. My creditors are getting impatient." Thanksgiving. That was less than 3 weeks away. The petition was scheduled to be filed on November 20th, with an emergency hearing set for November 27th, the day after Thanksgiving. They'd deliberately chosen that date, knowing that most people would be distracted by the holiday, that fewer witnesses would be available, that the court would be operating with a skeleton staff eager to process cases quickly and get back to their families. It was clever, I had to admit. But not clever enough. I called Richard Morrison and told him everything. Then I called Frank and told him to pull together every piece of evidence he'd collected. And then I made one more call, to the State Attorney General's office, to a prosecutor I'd known for years from my days on the State Chamber of Commerce. "Susan, this is William Thornberry. I need to report an attempted fraud. And it's going to be a big one." The next 2 weeks were a carefully choreographed performance. Derek called me several times, each time sounding more excited about introducing me to his friend, Marcus Vance. He suggested we could all meet for Thanksgiving dinner at my house, just a casual get-together where I could get to know Marcus and discuss my estate planning. "I'll even bring the turkey," Derek offered generously. "It's the least I can do for my favorite grandfather." I agreed, hiding my disgust behind a mask of grandfatherly affection. That sounds wonderful, Derek. Your mother will be here too, won't she? Of course. And I was thinking maybe we could invite a few other people, make it a real family gathering. Maybe Marcus could bring his wife. I almost laughed. He wanted witnesses. People who could later testify to my confused state, my inability to follow conversations, my general decline. It was all part of the setup. Sure, I said, adding a slight quaver to my voice. Though I have to say, I'm getting a bit tired these days. Big gatherings can be overwhelming. Don't worry, Grandpa, Derek said, his voice dripping with false concern. We'll keep it low-key. Just family and friends. Meanwhile, I was assembling my own guest list. With Susan Reeves from the Attorney General's office, we'd put together a plan that would expose Derek's scheme in the most public and devastating way possible. Susan had been excited about the case. Elder fraud was a growing problem, and she'd been looking for a high-profile case to bring attention to the issue. What you're describing is a textbook example of financial elder abuse, she told me. And with the evidence you've collected, we can make this stick. But I want to catch them in the act, on the record, with witnesses. Can you handle that? I'm 73 years old, Susan, not dead. I can handle it. She laughed. I believe you. Here's what we're going to do. The plan was audacious, risky, and absolutely perfect. On Thanksgiving morning, I was up at dawn, filled with a nervous energy I hadn't felt in years. Margaret arrived first, letting herself in with her key and bringing bags of groceries for the dinner preparations. Dad, she called out. I'm here. Where are you? I came down the stairs slowly, deliberately shuffling my feet a bit. Margaret, dear. Is it Thursday already? She looked at me with concern. It's Thanksgiving, Dad. Remember? We're having dinner here today. Of course, I said, waving my hand vaguely. I remember. Derek's bringing the turkey. That's right. She came over and kissed my cheek, and I felt a pang of guilt for deceiving her. But it was necessary. She needed to see the truth about her son, no matter how painful it would be. Over the next hour, Margaret bustled around the kitchen, preparing side dishes and setting the dining room table. I sat in my chair, pretending to doze while actually reviewing my mental notes for what was to come. Derek arrived at noon, carrying a large roasting pan with an already cooked turkey. Behind him came Marcus Vance, a slick-looking man in his early 40s with carefully groomed hair and an expensive suit, and a woman who Vance introduced as his wife, though Frank had discovered she was actually his paralegal, brought along to serve as an additional witness. Grandpa, Derek said loudly, as if I were hard of hearing. Happy Thanksgiving. I blinked at him. Derek? Is it really you? Of course it's me, Grandpa. He exchanged a knowing glance with Vance. I want you to meet my friend Marcus. Remember, I told you about him? Marcus, I said slowly, frowning. Do I know you? We've never met, Mr. Thornberry, Vance said smoothly, coming forward to shake my hand. But Derek has told me so much about you. It's an honor to meet you. For the next hour, I played my role perfectly. I called Margaret by my late wife's name twice. I forgot that I'd already asked about the cranberry sauce. I told the same story about my army days 3 times. I was the picture of a man in cognitive decline. And Derek and Vance were eating it up. I could see them exchanging glances, making mental notes, building their case with every confused statement I made. We sat down to dinner at 2 o'clock. The table was beautiful. Margaret had outdone herself, and the food was excellent. As we ate, the conversation flowed around me, and I continued my act, seeming to drift in and out of attention, occasionally making non sequiturs or asking questions that had already been answered. Then, halfway through the meal, I decided it was time. You know, I said, my voice suddenly clear and strong. This reminds me of a Thanksgiving dinner I attended back in 1983. I was negotiating the purchase of a commercial property downtown, and the seller tried to cheat me. He thought I was too trusting, too eager to make the deal. He created false documents, inflated appraisals, even brought in fake witnesses to testify about the property's value. Derek had stopped eating, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. Vance's expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. The thing is, I continued, I knew what he was doing all along. I'd done my homework, you see. I'd investigated him, researched the property, talked to the right people. So when we sat down to close the deal, I had quite a surprise waiting for him. Dad, Margaret said, that's a fascinating story, but maybe we should. No, let him finish, Derek said quietly. His face had gone pale. I smiled at him. I brought the police to that closing, and the district attorney, and several witnesses who could testify to the fraud. The seller went to prison for 5 years, and had bought the property at auction for pennies on the dollar. The room had gone absolutely silent. The moral of the story, I said, looking directly at Derek, is that you should never assume your Mark is as stupid as you think he is. Derek's mouth opened, but no sound came out. I reached under my chair and pulled out a thick manila folder. This folder contains copies of every email, every text message, every recorded conversation between you and Mr. Vance regarding your plan to have me declared incompetent and steal my estate. It includes documentation of your gambling debts, your involvement in a fraudulent investment scheme, and your conspiracy to commit elder fraud against me. I slid the folder across the table to him. It also includes a copy of the completely fraudulent medical report prepared by Dr. Reginald Hayworth, who examined me without my knowledge or consent, or rather, who claimed to have examined me when no such examination ever took place. Vance had stood up, his face flushed. Now wait just a minute. Sit down, Mr. Vance, I said coldly. I'm not finished. Derek, Margaret gasped. What is Dad talking about? Derek's hands were shaking. Grandpa, I don't know what you think you know, but I think I know that you owe $380,000 to various gambling establishments and loan sharks. I interrupted. I think I know that you're under investigation by the SEC for securities fraud. I think I know that you've been planning for at least 6 months to have me declared mentally incompetent so you could take control of my assets and use them to pay off your debts. I pulled out my phone and pressed a button. I also think you should know that this entire conversation has been recorded and streamed live to the State Attorney General's office, where prosecutors are currently preparing charges against both you and Mr. Vance. The doorbell rang, perfectly on cue. That would be them now, I said, standing up from the table. Despite my earlier performance, I moved with perfect steadiness, walking to the front door and opening it wide. Susan Reeves stood on my porch, flanked by 2 state police officers. Behind them were 3 more officers and several people I recognized from the Attorney General's investigative unit. William, Susan said formally, thank you for your cooperation in this matter. My pleasure, I replied, stepping aside to let them in. What followed was almost anticlimactic after all the build-up. The officers read Derek and Vance their rights and placed them under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and a host of other charges. Vance's wife tried to make a run for it but was stopped at the back door by officers who'd been stationed around the property. Margaret sat at the dining table, tears streaming down her face, unable to comprehend what was happening. I sat down beside her and took her hand. I'm so sorry you had to find out this way, I said gently. But Derek had made his choice, and I couldn't let him get away with it. How long have you known? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Since September. I'd been investigating him ever since he first approached me about my estate planning. She looked at me, really looked at me, and saw that there was nothing wrong with my mind, that there never had been. You were pretending this whole time. I needed him to think his plan was working. I needed him to go forward with it, to create evidence of his intent. If I'd confronted him early on, he might have just abandoned the scheme and tried something else later. This way, we have everything we need to ensure he faces real consequences. He's my son, she said, fresh tears spilling over. I know. And I'm sorry. But he's also a criminal who is willing to destroy me, to destroy both of us, to save himself. What kind of man does that make him? She had no answer for that. The officers led Derek and Vance out of the house in handcuffs. As Derek passed by me, he stopped and looked at me with pure hatred in his eyes. I'm your grandson, he hissed. How could you do this to me? I looked at him coldly. I'm your grandfather. How could you do this to me? He had no answer for that either. The next few months were difficult, but ultimately satisfying. Derek and Marcus Vance were both charged with multiple felonies. The case became something of a media sensation. Grandson's greed, the Thanksgiving Day takedown, was the headline in the local paper. Other news outlets picked up the story, and suddenly I was fielding interview requests from news programs and magazines interested in covering the case. I gave exactly one interview, to a reporter who'd always been fair and accurate in her coverage. I used the platform to talk about elder fraud, about the warning signs, about the importance of protecting elderly relatives from exploitation, not by isolating them or controlling their finances, but by staying connected, staying engaged, and staying alert. The greatest protection against elder abuse, I said, is having a strong, supportive family and community. Ironically, the abusers often try to cut those ties, to isolate their victims. If someone in your life suddenly starts suggesting that grandma shouldn't be driving anymore, or shouldn't be handling her own money, or shouldn't be making her own decisions, ask yourself what they have to gain from that. The interview was viewed over 1 million times online and led to several other victims of similar schemes coming forward. The Attorney General's office ended up opening a dedicated elder fraud division, with Susan Reeves as its director. Derek's trial lasted 3 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming: the emails, the recordings, the testimony from Frank and other investigators, my own testimony about Derek's visits and behavior. The doctor, Hayworth, had already pleaded guilty to fraud and agreed to testify against Derek and Vance in exchange for a reduced sentence. In the end, Derek was convicted on all counts. The judge, a woman in her 60s who'd clearly been moved by the case, delivered a scathing rebuke from the bench. Mr. Thornberry, you betrayed the trust of your own grandfather, a man who by all accounts loved you and provided for you throughout your life. You sought not just to steal his money, but to rob him of his dignity, his autonomy, and his final years of independence. You were willing to have him declared mentally incompetent, knowing the devastating effect this would have on his life, all to satisfy your own greed and recklessness. This court finds your conduct to be particularly heinous. She sentenced him to 8 years in prison, with no possibility of parole before serving at least 5. Marcus Vance got 10 years, the extra time reflecting his role as the architect of the scheme and his history of preying on vulnerable seniors. The SEC also completed their investigation into Derek's company, resulting in criminal charges for securities fraud. Derek pleaded guilty to those charges as well, receiving an additional 5-year sentence to run consecutively with his sentence for the elder fraud case. All told, my grandson would be in prison for at least 13 years. Margaret struggled with the outcome. She was angry at Derek, devastated by his betrayal, but also heartbroken at seeing her son sent to prison. She went to therapy, joined a support group for families of incarcerated individuals, and slowly began to rebuild her life. Our relationship, thankfully, survived. She understood that I'd had no choice, that Derek had forced my hand. And in time, she even thanked me for stopping him before he could do even more damage. He would have destroyed himself completely if you hadn't intervened, she told me one evening as we sat on my porch, watching the sunset. At least this way, he has a chance to get help, to face what he's done, to maybe become a better person someday. I nodded, though privately I doubted Derek would ever truly change. Some people, when cornered, show you who they really are. And what I'd seen in Derek's eyes that Thanksgiving Day wasn't remorse or shame, it was rage at being caught. As for me, I took steps to ensure that something like this could never happen again. I restructured my estate planning to include multiple layers of oversight and protection. I established a charitable foundation that would receive the bulk of my assets upon my death, with Margaret provided for but the majority of the money going to causes I cared about, including, ironically enough, elder abuse prevention programs. I also became more involved in my community, volunteering with organizations that supported seniors and educated them about financial fraud. I gave talks at senior centers, community colleges, and even at the state legislature, advocating for stronger protections against elder abuse. Frank and I remained close friends, meeting weekly for chess and conversation. He'd retired from investigative work after my case, declaring it the perfect finale to his career. "I've been doing this for 40 years, he told me, and I've never seen a more satisfying takedown. The look on that kid's face when you pulled out that folder, that's going to keep me warm for the rest of my life." The story might have ended there, a clean resolution with the bad guys in prison and the victim vindicated. But life, I've learned, rarely offers such tidy endings. About 2 years after Derek's conviction, I received a letter from him. It was forwarded through Margaret, who'd maintained minimal contact with him despite his imprisonment. She brought it to me on a Sunday afternoon, looking troubled. "I haven't read it," she said, "but he asked me to make sure you got it. I told him I'd deliver it, but that you might not read it. I wanted to give you the choice." I took the letter and thanked her. After she left, I sat in my study for a long time, holding the envelope, debating whether to open it or simply throw it away. Finally, curiosity won out. I opened the envelope and read. The letter was surprisingly well written, lacking the usual grammatical errors and casual tone of Derek's previous communications. He must have worked hard on it, probably drafting and redrafting multiple times. He started with an apology, a real one, not the "I'm sorry you feel that way" non-apology that people use when they're caught. He acknowledged what he'd done, the pain he'd caused, the betrayal of trust. He took full responsibility, without excuses or justifications. Then he talked about his time in prison, about the therapy he'd been receiving, about facing his gambling addiction and his character flaws. He wrote about the shame of having to explain to other inmates what he was in for, about the contempt he'd faced from men who had their own codes about family loyalty. "I've had a lot of time to think about who I became," he wrote, "and how I got there. The gambling started in college, just small bets with friends, but it grew into something that consumed me. And instead of asking for help, instead of being honest with you and Mom, I lied. I buried myself deeper and deeper, convinced that one big win would fix everything." He wrote about the investment scheme, about how he'd known it was fraudulent but had told himself it was just creative finance, that everyone in tech was doing the same thing. He wrote about Marcus Vance, about how Vance had seemed to offer a way out, a solution to all his problems. "I convinced myself that you'd be fine," he wrote. "That you had more money than you could ever spend, that you were old and wouldn't really be affected by what we were planning. I dehumanized you in my mind, turned you